Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our second podcast episode of Medicratic. My name is Stefan and I'm joined here by two of my colleagues, Warren and Soroush. Today our topic is going to be something that's fairly familiar to everyone. We're going to be discussing the ethical principles as well as some history of quarantine. So if any of you guys want to start us off by maybe discussing some ethical principles, we can start discussing that.
So I think we can start by defining what quarantine actually is, and then we can discuss, how, under what circumstances we can apply it, and what other factors should be considered.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We should get a baseline kind of for what we're going to be discussing throughout the rest of this episode. So I guess we can maybe just say a quarantine is just separation of individuals during an incubation period of some sort of pathogen. And then we need to kind of talk about what principles we have to meet in order to make sure that quarantine is ethical. So I think, Soroush, you had some ideas about that.
So I think we can consider a few factors to make it more ethical. One would be that we should only apply it whenever the disease is highly transmissible. So if the more contagious the disease is, I think the benefits of the quarantine will increase. The second thing is that I think whenever a government is imposing quarantine laws, they should be honest as much as possible with the public, provide the most amount of information regarding why we are doing this. This is the nature of the disease, and this is how we want to prevent it. And at the same time, if they are keeping people at their houses, they should provide adequate supplies, like the necessities like food, groceries, medicine supplies. But for our case with COVID-19, like mask, sanitizer. I think in that regard, this makes it the most ethical way possible.
Yeah, so they did that definitely, I think, to an extent at the start of this pandemic. But the main kind of thing that I think people were discussing a lot at the start was, were they transparent about some things? So I don't know what you guys think about that. Did they communicate clearly the objectives and the goals at the start of the pandemic? Did they clearly outline the facts?
I think most of it was just stay inside so that you don't get people sick, right? So that we don't spread the disease around or the pathogen as much as it would if everyone just went out everywhere. A lot of the actual scientific stuff I don't think was really explained because, as you see, a lot of people are very worried about pathogens and vaccines and everything, so it wouldn't really benefit that much to explain it other than the danger, kind of like a fear-mongering, although there was an actual threat associated with it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because while the government definitely had to be transparent and communicative with the population, how much do you actually tell them, right? Because you don't want to induce fear and panic into the population, obviously, but some people are more comfortable knowing more information and some people are more comfortable knowing less, or just, not knowing what you don't know. So they were pretty transparent in that sense, but they couldn't really satisfy everyone. And so a lot of people, I think, complained about, the government and things that they weren't talking about, but it's difficult to satisfy everyone. So I don't know, I think they handled it relatively well, but I think there could have been some things that they should have done differently. For example, I think at the start of the pandemic, like a really basic idea was the masks. I remember there was a lot of dispute as to whether we should be wearing masks or not. And I think that in Canada anyway, they said that we should be wearing masks, and then a week and a half later they said that masks aren't necessary, and then after that they said masks are necessary again. And we know obviously now that masks do stop the spread of COVID, but I don't know, how do you guys think they handled that aspect of the communication?
To be honest, some information about the COVID was actually unknown at the time they were talking about it. So I think you guys remember when we were in our first year, the whole thing just happened in like weeks. We just heard, oh, there's this small virus in China, and then in a few weeks it was in Canada and everything got shut down. So I think it was very new for the world in general and for obviously the healthcare sector. So they didn't know it back then how useful the mask actually is. But I think they had some general ideas. Okay, it's gonna work. They did more research on it, probably later figured, okay, maybe it's not that useful because the size of the virus is insanely small. Then they went on and said that, oh, they actually come in droplets, which can be prevented by the mask pores. So I think they were explaining what they knew at that specific time.
Yeah, I think that they did pretty well in that regard. But yeah, it's hard to really know. And that's a good point you brought up because it was a new situation, but how new was it? Like thinking historically, right? Different types of pandemics throughout history, which was something interesting that I think we read up on a bit. But people were wearing masks like 100 years ago during some of those quarantines. So I think that it was during the smallpox epidemic that they were actually wearing masks. I don't know how much they actually knew about the effectiveness of it. They also had, even back in like the 14th century or whatever, they had isolation protocols for 40 days or something like that. So do you think that I guess my question is, how important was our historical experience with quarantine in this new pandemic? Do you think that it was a completely new experience for COVID, or do you think that we could build off of a lot of what we learned throughout history?
It is interesting because like the origin of like having masks, it was simply that we want to minimize the interaction as much as possible. But the thing is, it is not successful in all the diseases. So you know that during the bubonic plague, like in Europe, you see those pictures of the physicians with the crow mask and like those stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were not as effective, mostly because of the bubonic plague. It's rarely transmissible from like person to person. It comes from the fleas. So it was not useful during then. It was not useful during the cholera outbreak in Europe because it was getting mostly transmitted through water. But it was definitely useful against Spanish flu after the World War I. And because they found a very big similarities between the Spanish flu and the COVID, mostly because that they were both respiratory diseases, that they're quite airborne and they quite transmissible. They probably thought that, okay, if it's airborne and if it's contagious, by we cover mask and we can have a distance from each other, like I think like 2 meters or something like that, we're gonna prevent the transmission. So I think the general idea, whether initially we should use mask or not, probably came from the experience with the Spanish flu and SARS. I think it was in the early 2000s. Those definitely helped a lot to know whether we should have a mask or not.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think SARS, because it's more recent, and this is a variation of that. So that was pretty useful as well. But I think COVID is more transmissible than the Spanish flu, right? Or was it the other way around?
I think it is more transmissible.
Mm-hmm. Less deadly, I think. So that's a payoff for that. But yeah, we talked about a few of the principles there. So I think, the main one was from an ethical standpoint, public health transparency. But also you mentioned making sure that resources are filled out. So like masks, sanitizer, food and things. How well do you think they actually handled that aspect of the pandemic?
I think for the provision of hand sanitizer, it really didn't work out for the first even year or so. It's pretty hard to get sanitizer. I remember, at least in my family, we were just making it ourselves because you couldn't buy it anywhere, at least in our small town. And you always have the people who are freaking out, like with the whole toilet paper thing, like buying up all the toilet paper. But I remember, like, I live in a small town. It's near Toronto. One of our problems was that people from larger cities would come and buy most of the PPE or most of the sanitizer, and they would take it back home with them. So we were kind of bereft of those safety measures for a while. It worked out for us because we didn't really get a lot of COVID in our town. Just a few cases here and there, but we really didn't have that much spread around for everyone to use.
Yeah, I can imagine because like the mask prices I think increased so much at the start of the pandemic. It was impossible to get N95 masks and things. I mean, I think that was mainly because the hospitals were saying like, we need the N95 masks here, so you guys shouldn't buy them. But yeah, I think that almost up until the vaccine was starting to be widely distributed, it was pretty hard to get a lot of things. Maybe masks were a bit easier later on after a few months once people started getting used to the whole pandemic. But other than that, it was like a lot of like sanitizer, different foods, toilet paper, whatever, all that stuff was much harder to get. So it was very interesting. What was the deal with the toilet paper thing? I still don't understand that. Why did everyone decide to just go buy tons of toilet paper?
From what I remember, I read up on it like a year ago, but I think one of the major toilet paper producers is China. And because of COVID, they thought that the factories were going to shut down and stop producing toilet paper. So, I mean, if you read that, then logically you'd say, oh, because they're not making it anymore, we won't be able to buy it, so we should buy it all now. But
okay.
It didn't really work out that way. I don't remember if the factories in China were shut down or if they just took over more production locally, but it wasn't what they thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
I'm pretty certain many people who start buying those toilet papers, they didn't actually know why they need it. I think they saw everybody else is buying it. So, and I think one of the things that government could do better was that be a little bit more honest about the nature of the disease. I think that why people start like buying every single thing, even though they didn't need them, was that they were afraid like how serious this pandemic was. I think they thought this is sort of a super deadly virus that they have to stay at their homes and not even like leave it for 1 second. I think they were very scared, and that's why they did all these behaviors. But at the same time, the government couldn't really say, oh, okay, the mortality rate of the disease is quite low, because otherwise people wouldn't take the quarantine seriously.
Yeah, there had to be a good balance of how do you not make everyone panic, but how do you make everyone listen, right?
Yes.
And so, I mean, especially in very democratic countries like Canada and the United States, it's hard to convince a lot of people because, I think they try to blindly follow their freedom, right? So I don't want to get too political in this podcast, but I think it was just interesting to see how a lot of people, they just wouldn't listen to reason about quarantines and masks and things, and would rather think that, oh, I can do whatever I want just because the government is telling me to do something. I'm not going to do it. Which, in my opinion, doesn't really make much sense because you follow a lot of other laws. Why not just follow this one? Like, don't kill someone, right? Because the government tells you to do that. But yeah, I thought it was very interesting to see how the government, I think they handled it decent, like I said before, like pretty well in the sense that like a lot of people did follow the quarantine procedures and they did wear masks, and there was obviously a few outliers, but overall I think it was pretty successful.
This type of quarantine we had, it's not even considered quarantine when you compare it with the previous pandemics. I think they learned very, very valuable lessons from the history of the quarantine, because for the COVID-19 quarantine, it was quite decent relative to what they did in the past. Like back then, even not that long ago, I think it was 1890, so like 100 years ago, when the typhoon was getting close to North America, there was this island near the St. Lawrence River. So they said, okay, any type of ships or cargo that's coming to like close to Canada, they should stay there for a while, like in specific buildings on the island. They were basically trying to do the same thing they did with the bubonic plague in Italy. So they had these specific islands and they asked you to stay there for a certain period of time, which was 40. And those buildings, they didn't provide them with food or like clean clothes. So if you were a healthy person in that building, you would have get the disease no matter what, because you're staying beside someone who probably has the disease. I think like few thousand people die on that island because of the typhoon.
Yeah, so I think they did something similar in New York when they like all the immigrants that were coming into New York I think in that time period as well. Maybe we're talking about the same thing, but on Ellis Island, near New York City in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they made like quarantine centers for immigrants, and they would keep them in hospitals so that before they got into the United States, they would pass that procedure, which 40 days I think was the general rule of thumb.
So I think another cool topic to talk about for quarantines historically that we might be able to apply right now is the persecution of certain groups of people that have happened as a result of quarantines. For example, way back in the day, about 500 AD, people who were known as lepers, so they were individuals who were identifiably ill, very ill, were actually not allowed to associate with healthy people in many cities, including the Lyons. The Council of Lyons back then decided that it would be illegal for these people to associate with healthy or, in their sense, normal. So it was kind of a way to restrict these people from interacting with each other. And this might seem like a very, like, oh, way back in the day they did this. But even up until 1983 in Cuba with HIV, what they did in Cuba was that anyone who was known to test positive for HIV was actually quarantined within a sanatorium indefinitely, which was then changed a couple of years later to just, a short period of time. I don't know the exact date, but these individuals were just taken out of society for no real reason other than their disease, and were just locked away. So I wonder if we can see any parallels of persecution in our current day pandemic and what we think about that, maybe with the vaccine passports or something.
Yeah, there might be a level of persecution for people that are not vaccinated, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, yeah, the leprosy thing, because that's so like visible, right? Like leprosy kind of disfigures the body, because I think that it gets into the muscles and things like that. It completely disfigures a person, and so it's quite obvious to see when someone is suffering from leprosy. But yeah, now it's a bit less common, so you don't really know who's vaccinated and who's not. Like, you can pretty much assume that a lot of people are vaccinated, but some people aren't. And so there is a level of persecution that I think in some situations may not be quite justified, because we've been talking a lot about getting vaccinated. It's very important to get vaccinated, but some people it's a small percentage, but may not be able to get vaccinated. They might have health problems that are conflicting, and their physicians are recommending that they do not get vaccinated. I heard there's famous guitarist, you guys probably know him, Eric Clapton. I talk about him a lot. He's, I don't know, how old is he? He's like 78, something like that. He actually got his 2 doses of vaccine, or he got 1 dose, and he had a really, really bad like skin reaction. And I think that he was like almost hospitalized for a week or something like that. And he decided, and his physician recommended that he wouldn't get, booster doses and whatnot, or maybe not even in the 2nd dose. So basically the vaccine is not really effective with his immune system as it is right now. And he talked about that and kind of mentioned it, that the vaccine doesn't work for me. I think he didn't handle it so well, because he started kind of like bashing some parts of the vaccine, so that wasn't good. But a lot of people kind of went against him, kind of like zealots, saying that, he's kind of like an anti-vaxxer, like blah, blah, blah. And I don't think it was like entirely fair from that perspective, because individually for him, it didn't work, right? And just because of his vaccine status, he was being kind of, bashed on. So in certain situations, obviously there are people who choose not to get the vaccine. I don't think they are right, but there's also people that are physically incapable of receiving the vaccine, even though it's a small population. And so those people, I don't think, deserve to be persecuted, kind of in a similar sense of what we were talking about for the leprosy. So I don't know what you guys think about that, but that's kind of like my point of view for that situation.
I think that's a really good point, honestly. Like, some people can't do it. They can't get that vaccine because it'd be worse for them to get it than to not get it. But in other cases too, some people just choose not to get it, right? And
yeah.
I mean, personally, I think I'm fine with that. Their right to not get it is okay, as long as it's just a minority of the population that's doing that, because then we still get the herd immunity. But I know, I've heard stories. I don't personally know these people, but I know friends of friends who do not get the vaccine and have a fake passport.
Oh, yeah.
So what do you guys think about that situation there?
Extremely illegal. That's like forging identity to an extent, right? Because, yeah, not only is that just not legal, but it's not legal for a reason. It's because if you're allowed to go into certain areas because you supposedly have a vaccine passport, you can actually cause harm, right, to individuals. Like, I don't know, let's say you're a guy who fakes his vaccine passport and he walks into a retirement home with some people who are physically incapable of receiving a vaccine or protection, right? You're putting a lot of people at risk in that situation. But then at the same time, I'm not sure how exactly the herd immunity concept works from that point of view, because, it may be extremely unlikely for these limited number of people who have these fake vaccine passports to actually transmit the virus, right?
Yeah,
so
that's true.
I mean, it's there's some people that do it. How dangerous is it? I'm not sure. If there's a lot of people doing it, then that's a different story, because, you basically, it would be like back to square one at the start of the pandemic, when people just didn't have vaccines, right? They were just transmitting the virus without any protection against it. So, yeah, I don't know. I guess from a health standpoint, it wouldn't be too big of a problem, but you need those enforcements in order to stop that from happening. I mean, I feel like a lot of people wouldn't do that anyway, but it's pretty dumb. So, yeah, I don't know, but...
So, did they have vaccine passports in Iran, Soroush?
No, actually. Like, definitely not vaccine passport, but I'm thinking that did they even require you to give them any sort of proof that you have been vaccinated? Again, I do not think so, because when I was in Iran, it was still during the pandemic. There was some laws in place. And like, for some reason, I had to go to some government buildings because I had to do some paperwork. It's funny, they didn't ask me, or they didn't even care to like being vaccinated. They just ask you to have a mask. It's very interesting because the vaccination rate in Iran is very, very high. So once the vaccine was available, the vast majority of the populations just rushed to get vaccinated. They were like very willing to do it.
Are you allowed to not get the vaccine in Iran?
There's no law that says, oh, you have to have been vaccinated. I have few family members that they chose not to.
That's interesting. What's the percentage of cases, I'm curious, compared to Canada?
Oh, how many people got infected?
Yeah, like recently.
Recently, because the number was so low, they didn't announce it. But at the beginning of the pandemic, the number was very, very high. And unfortunately, many people lost their lives, like probably in combination of the COVID and every other like factor. I think that scared people a lot because every single day on the news, I was seeing that they were announcing the number of the new cases and the number of deaths and also the number of deaths in total. I think that frightened public a lot to take these measures more seriously themselves without forcing them to do so. And also when the vaccine was available, because people were afraid that they might actually lose their life to COVID, they actually wanted to get vaccinated. And the number of the cases dropped like very, very fast after the vaccines become available.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I don't want to... We have a lot to talk about, but I don't think we want to continue this for hours on end. So I guess we can just do like a quick recap and end this episode.
Sure.
So I think we started off, we talked about some of the public health communications at the start. We talked about resources. We talked about a lot of histories of quarantines, so the 40 days, and then I think we just ended there with some more principles on what Warren was talking about the oh, my mind is blanking. What were we just talking about?
The persecution of certain groups.
Yes, the persecution and then the vaccine passports, and then we ended there. So yeah, I think that was pretty good. I don't know what we're going to talk about next time, but we'll think about something else to discuss in our third episode. So yeah, thanks everyone for listening.